Good afternoon and welcome to the third masterclass on GST being organized by the Institute of Company Secretaries of India. We have with us today CS Bishwajit Das as the faculty for the day. He will be dwelling upon the constitutional provisions vis-a-vis indirect taxation and the concepts of appeal and revision under the model GST law. Mr. Das is an advocate at the Supreme Court of India and managing partner of Juris in Juris. He specializes in food law, corporate laws, IP laws, revenue laws, mining and environmental laws, and arbitration law, along with corporate finance. Being a qualified company secretary, CFA, CSA, and an advocate, he successfully combines the structural aspects of the corporate bodies with their problems and prospects faced by them during the course of their functioning. He has an experience of over 14 years in this field. I now request Sir to take us through the constitutional provisions vis-a-vis indirect taxes and the concepts of appeal and revision. Sir, please.
Thank you, Saurav. Given one of the most difficult subject and being a qualified company secretary, and that this particular program is being organized by the Institute of Company Secretary of India, I know what is the curriculum of the qualified company secretary professionals and what is exactly are their need. Today we are entering into one of the important era, so to speak, of good and service tax regime, a one nation, one market regime. This is certainly one of the biggest constitutional amendment, if I may say so, one of the single most biggest constitutional amendment was carried out to the Constitution of India. It was a call from all sections of the society, in particular the commercial world, that we should have a one regime of tax and avoid the tax on tax illegal concept and illegal application of cascading effect of the tax on tax on the citizens, corporate bodies, and this is where now the entire political class came together to give us the one which we all along wanted for a one unified taxing regime for a country which is aspiring to go global in a big way and assert its position as one of the next economic power of the world. Friends, being a qualified company secretary and now into practice of law, what I have realized that mere knowledge of substantive law itself is not sufficient. Yes, we are all rejoiced by the fact that the GST regime is now becoming reality, as only yesterday the President of India has given assent to that of this 122nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 2014, and the next course of action would be notifying this constitutional amendment and then constituting the GST Council to carry this regime forward, while the central GST and the state GST and the IGST, the intermediate GST, integrated GST, will be enacted by the Parliament and the respective state legislatures. Yes, this is where the qualified professionals, even the ordinary citizens, need to know what is the concept of constitutionality vis-a-vis tax, whether it is direct tax or indirect tax, though the subject is given to me that the provisions of the Constitution vis-a-vis indirect tax. As you all know, in a civil society, in a country where we all citizens have given ourselves this Constitution to govern us through the executive and through the court for adjudication of the grievances, the Constitution gives the source of power for our governance, and we the citizens will be governed through legislation only. What is the concept of tax? First of all, I will try to, all my endeavors would be to explain this concept in a simplistic manner. What are the principal provisions of the Constitution? Broadly, A. B. I will also explain side by side the legal concepts, the principles that we will come across, whether as a practitioner, whether as a service provider, manufacturer, corporate entities, academicians, legal practitioners. What is that concept of tax? The expression tax has not been defined in the Constitution, in the sense that it has to be understood, and the courts from time to time, the apex court from time to time has given the meaning of tax. And what is this concept of tax? And tax includes also, there are various kinds of revenue that the state generate. One is a tax, second is a duties, third is cess, surcharge, then your royalty, then your fees. These are different kinds of revenue generating mechanism by which the central government and the state government generate the fund for the governance of the country. From time to time, court have defined that tax is an act of exaction, and that exaction is done through a legislation by exercising the power under the Constitution. And why it is relevant to know the constitutional provisions is this: even tomorrow we will see the act, the central act, state act, and that in order to apply that, the principles of constitutional schemes need to be understood properly. One, for the purpose of the judicial review, if need be. Two, for the proper administration of that statute. And this tax is an exaction, and this is being regarded as a sovereign power for the states to obtain tax from that of the citizens within the territory, within their respective territory, and use it for the purpose of governance, social activities, the administrative expenses, etc. And the Constitution has been divided into, as we all know, the Constitution has got 395 articles, which is divided in 22 parts with a preamble at the top and 12 annexes to it. The preamble gives the idea about what is exactly the Union of India is, and courts have defined the preamble as part of the Constitution and have imbibed the expressions from the preamble to say that this is the basic structure of the Constitution to secure justice, to promote harmony, and the first part is the preamble, second is the citizenship. As far as this particular subject is concerned, I am only going to highlight the important part of the Constitution. The preamble, second is your citizenship. We are all citizens. We are entitled to ask the questions to that of the legislature, the executive, what kind of regulation they are making. If tomorrow the act will come, and now that the constitution has been amended and it will be notified, whether it is in sync with that of the constitutional philosophies or not. So, citizenship is a second part as far as this particular discussions goes, but it is covered under the part 2. Then important facets is the state, which is defined under article 12 under part 3, which covers the fundamental rights. There is also a fundamental duties prescribed for that of the citizens, which is part 4A, and directive principles of state policy, which is in the part 4. These are important facets and the important parts of the constitution, which enables us to understand how concepts work, how the constitution works, how the executive function, how the judicial review can be operated upon on the acts of omission or commission on the part of the states. And that is why these principles need to be understood properly to be able to understand whether as a practitioners, whether as a citizens of this country, as I have told you. There is, as you know, a country cannot run like this. It has to have an executive which will administer the country, and it will have a legislature, the parliament at the union, at the center, and the state legislature at the state level, the assembly. And then there will be a judiciary which will scrutinize the actions of the executive and the parliament. It will scrutinize the actions of the parliament on legislation, and it will scrutinize the actions of the executive on the day-to-day functioning and in administration of statutes. So, that is how our governance of this country is designed. Executive will run the country, legislature will give us the law, and the judiciary will scrutinize the actions of both the legislature and the executive. And that is how the entire design is given to us, we the people of India. There is also a CAG, the auditor at the state level, and at the central level, the comptroller and auditor general, that is a constitutional body. Then there is a federal structure in a democratic polity in our country, governed by the Constitution of India. There is a federal structure. Now, here is the most significant aspect that you need to understand, that in a federal structure, because we are one nation but two states, one at the center and the other at the state level, but we are one citizen country. All the citizens have only one citizenship, unlike in America. So, therefore, the entire structure of Indian constitution designed to give to us a federal polity, where there is a separation of powers between the center and the states have happened. Your friends will know that we are hankering for the GST since ages now. And why I say that this is one of the single most important legislation happened, a constitutional amendment carried out, because it is nothing to do with that of the interest of the citizens was involved. Here there was a tug of war happening between the center and the states regarding the legislative relationship under the part 11 of the Constitution of India. Part 11 plays an important role, and here the entire amendment to the Constitution, the 122nd amendment carried out to part 11 of the Constitution of India, which gives the power to that of the states as well as the center to legislate law. And 7th schedule is a flowing from the Constitution, section article 246, which segregates the list 1, list 2 and list 3, which segregates the items, the areas of legislative power and the competence of the state and the union. And the first amendment which was been, the incorporation has happened, the insertion of article 246A, which gives the power both to the center and the state to legislate law qua the supply of the goods and services, supply the tax, the GST on the supplied goods and services. That is the insertion of article 246A. That is the first amendment carried out in the 122nd Constitution Amendment. And this delay in bringing about this legislation, and this is a phenomenal enactment that has happened, is we found a way out to resolve the dispute between the fiscal autonomy of the state vis-a-vis the center, because the state and the union, which are given the respective areas of legislative areas to legislate law, qua the taxation, a compromise is arrived at by way of a constitutional body like GST Council, which is under through insertion of article 279A. Now, why I am going into the field of the entire scheme of the constitution, to make you understand that what was the reason why there has been inordinate delay in bringing about a good positive legislation, because there was a tug of war between the state and the union regarding their financial autonomy, and a compromise was arrived at. Therefore, it is not an ideal GST, but a compromise GST, a dual GST was arrived at, where for a particular transaction of supply of goods and services, a dual GST will be imposed with a concurrent components of central GST and the state GST. And that is how the role of the statutory body, independent of the power of that of the center and the state, will facilitate the operation of this particular regime. And that is a big change in terms of our polity, in terms of how our taxation legislation will operate. Because as you know, whether it is the Central Sales Tax Act and then subsequently the Local Sales Tax Act converted to the VAT, a non-cascading effect taxation regime, and of course, this is also a non-taxation, non-cascading taxation regime is coming through the GST. By this legislation and through a constitutional body like GST, the problem of fiscal legislation, the autonomy between the state and the center has been resolved. And in the constitutional amendment, the legislative relations between the center and the state, it has always been a dispute throughout our constitutional journey. In area where the state will exercise its legislative power, claiming under particular entry of the union list, the state list, then the courts will come to the judicial review. Through judicial review, court will come to strike down that provision, that enactment of the state, claiming that it is within the territory of center and you cannot legislate. There are umpteen number of instances where many legislation, the first important legislation happened in the year 1960, where a constitution bench, Atiabari case, in the state of Assam, this constitution bench, a 5-judge bench, struck down that particular legislation, claiming, of course, not under the entry, though it was invoked under entry 52 of the state list, but it was struck down by the court in exercise of a judicial review. So, the respective legislative relationship between the state and the union, qua the union list, state list and the concurrent list of the state 7th schedule, as prescribed under article 246, to prevent any friction, but adventurism continued. And now, through this particular legislation, perhaps we will see a lesser number of litigation in terms of the challenge to the taxing legislation of the union and the states. the indirect tax provisions. What do you mean by that? As I told you, the tax, there are various ways of generation of revenue by the states. One is a tax, one is a royalty, one is a cess, one is a duty, duties of excise, service tax, excise, entry tax, entertainment tax. There are different kinds of tax, there are different kinds of excise, there are different kinds of duties, then the cess, then the fees, royalty, etc. But these different kind of expressions and the legislations are being interpreted differently at different point in time in respect of the nature of the transaction, taxing legislation. And the part 11 talks about that 7th schedule. Then there is an important part which is part 13, which says that the freedom of the trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India is an important facets of the constitution, which is always invoked to test the taxing legislation's legality, the virus. That is why the concept of a constitution, which not only gives the power to that of the state and the union to legislate law, it also creates a restriction, and the one of such restriction is Article 286, qua interstate trade and commerce. Interstate during the course of sale and purchase, during the course of the movement of goods from one state to the other, or import or export. There is an embargo on the legislative power of that of the states, and the concept of legislative competence arises out of that. So, another restriction is there in part 13, which says that the trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India is free. Now that these provisions perhaps will not come in the way of the GST legality and validity, but to understand how the taxing legislation travelled over a period of time, and how the tax is treated differently, and how the fees and cesses legislations are treated differently. Everything that is being undertaken by the executive has to be guided by a foundation law, and the law making power lies with that of the parliament when it comes to the union, and the state assembly when it comes to the state, and that is how the entire structure of constitution operates. Now, any time any legislation comes, the first thing comes to the mind that whether that particular legislation passes the muster of the constitutional philosophy. And invariably all kinds of taxation legislations have been challenged in the court in terms of under Article 32 as well as 226 in judicial review. The parliament has a very much power to amend the constitution, but judicial review, a concept which arises out of Article 226 qua the High Court and Article 32 qua the Supreme Court, they exercises the judicial review to test the legal validity. Therefore, these concepts are essential to understand, and briefly I am only, because there is no sufficient time for us to cover the entire subjects, just giving you brief idea that these are the concepts which you should always remember. And there is schedule 7, which is extremely critical, which gives the separation, which decides the separation of the powers, legislative powers of the states and the union. And when you understand these concepts and the constitutional parts divided in different parts by 22 parts, with principles such as A, what is the judicial legislative competence, B, we are in the process of making the law. Of course, the constitution amendment has been completed now, but then draft model GST laws are in circulation, and that is part of a consultation, and that is called the that flows from that of the philosophy and the principles of democracy, where the political class, the representative of the people, while sitting in the assembly or the parliament, will frame the law for the citizen and the consultation will operate. And therefore, the role of the company secretary plays an important role when it comes to that of the practicing professionals. Company secretary seek an authorization under the new regime of GST, seeking recognition to that of the practicing company secretaries. And I happens to be the member of their core team on the GST, where we have analyzed the entire gamut of the model GST law. Every proposed sections, subsections are being analyzed by us, and the suggestions have been given to that of the empowered committee of state finance ministers, which will ultimately become the GST council. As you all know, once the constitution has been amended and it will be notified, then the president will be entitled to constitute the GST council within 60 days, and it will come. This empowered committee, before whom the institute is making all possible efforts to get the recognition of a practicing company secretary as the audit professional, I squarely believe that the practicing company secretaries have desired quality, wherewithal, know-how to be another qualified professional to be recognized in another special statutes in the growth for the next century Indian economy. They have the training, they have the expertise, and the institute, which through their committees and through their president, they are making all possible efforts to give that representation before the empowered committee. And I am sure the good sense will prevail, and the draft GST law which is in circulation will make necessary changes to incorporate the practicing company secretary to be a audit professional. But friends, one thing you should always remember: power comes with a responsibility, and that responsibility must be discharged with sincerity and honesty. And you need not have to claim without making them look like you deserve it. And while a legislation, the constitutional amendment is happening and happened already, and the model GST law is in process to put in place the entire taxing regime, demanding your entitlement as a one recognized auditor under the new regime. The facets of law plays an important role while you will discharge that responsibility. I am sure that you will discharge that responsibility with sincerity, and the government of the day, and of course the more important is the empowered committee and the GST council will recognize your importance and induct you as one of the audit professional. Having said that, coming back to my discussion on the constitutional provisions, now broadly these are the constitutional provisions. Always, please always keep in mind these principles. And what are those principles that operates within this framework? Part 13, which is a restriction on the legislative power of the union and the states, and every legislation are tested under that, and the first such legislation which ultimately went to the 5-judge constitution bench, Atiyabari, 1960, and then a clarification was sought on that particular judgment, that as to whether a tax legislation hampers or impedes freedom, free flow of the trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India. That entry tax law created in challenged in 1960 Atiyabari judgment, struck down that judgment. A clarification was also sought from that of a 7-judge constitution bench in that automobile transportation, and that judgment was holding forth till today, except a reference was made in the year 2010 by the Supreme Court Constitution bench doubting the correctness of that particular judgment as to whether tax per se, which is a sovereign function, can be regarded as a restrictive to trade, commerce and intercourse. And so therefore, whether the tax legislation per se should be tested under the part 13. And these are the important concepts you should always keep in mind, because now that a tax legislation is coming in, a new tax legislation is coming in, of course through an amendment to the parliament, but whether that particular legislation will pass the muster of that of the requirements of the test of restriction under the constitution and the principles, judicial principles, whether there is a legislative competence, whether there is a sovereign functions involved, to what an extent it has breached which principles of law, whether it has breached the basic structure of constitution as it has been decided in the year 1976-73 in that Keswanand Bharti's case. The basic structure came for the first time in Keswanand Bharti's case, the constitution based judgment, and reiterated and extended further in the Minerva Mills 1980 judgment. And now even the power to amend the constitution, which is provided under article 368, is not immune from that of the judicial scrutiny on the ground of the basic structure of the constitution. So therefore, whether the GST Act, this amendment of 122nd amendment, pass the test of the basic structure of the constitution. In this case, of course, now to be tested as to whether, I am sure almost all kind of tax legislations have come to that stage. One, I don't know, but this is definitely a far better legislation than that of the existing legislation on tax. So therefore, to my mind, it will pass the test of the muster of constitution, and it is rather a much beneficial legislation. And this aspect, as a professional, as an ordinary citizen, as a consumer, you should always know what is the concepts of constitutional schemes. The constitutional schemes is this, that the legislature will make the law for the citizens, and that law will be governed and administered by the executive. The citizens, upon agreed by the actions or omissions on the part of the executive of the legislature, can challenge that legislation before the judiciary in judicial review. And this is a beautiful empowerment of that of the every ordinary citizen. And therefore, you should know what is your fundamental right, what are the restrictions on the constitutional schemes in the legislating making power, whether a particular legislation has been done within the purview of their legislative competence, and whether a legislation made defeats the very basic structure of the constitution now propounded by the courts, saying that basic structure of the constitution is untouchable and cannot be breached. And what are those basic structures of the constitution? One is a judicial review, is a basic structure of constitution. Second, democracy. Then third, federal relationship between the union and states. And of course, the judicial review. These and fundamental rights, the golden triangle in the fundamental right, as we all know that the part 3, which is covering the fundamental rights of the citizens, which cannot be touched by the executive or the legislature except to the extent of the reasonable restriction, which is permissible within the purview of that particular right, because no power is absolute. There must be some reasonable restriction, and that concept of reasonable restriction is itself provided in the constitution. And here you should know what are your rights that flowing from that of the constitution, and if the law is being made by the parliament or the assembly in exercise of their power, and then whether they have the competence to make that law. if they have made that law, whether it is falling foul with that of the basic structures. So, these concepts, when understood properly, you as a citizen can assert your rights in a manner which you are expected to assert. The 1960 judgment of the Atiyabari case, where a state legislation on entry tax in exercise of the power under entry 52 of the state list of the 7th schedule, that legislation was struck down on the basis that tax per se is restrictive. A majority view formed this view in that judgment, that tax per se is restrictive, but without tax, how the executive will function. So, therefore, it has to earn the revenue from its citizens to govern them. Then in that judgment it was said, as long as a tax legislation is regulatory or functional in nature, it is not restrictive to trade, commerce and intercourse. Second, on a reference to the 1961 judgment, another interpretation came saying that if a tax is a compensatory in nature, then it is not restrictive of trade, commerce and intercourse. And in this case, the GST itself is supporting the trade, commerce and intercourse by making it transparent. We will discuss about the broad overview of that, of the benefits of the GST. So, that will, and if all the existing taxing legislations are found to be valid and legal, then obviously a better taxing legislation like GST will always pass through that moisture. But the idea of this particular discussion is to give you and impart in you the concepts of constitutional philosophies and the restrictions, the limitations provided in the constitution, and what is the concept of judicial review, how it can be invoked, when it can be invoked, who can invoke, and what will be the consequences thereunder. Therefore, these concepts, when to be read with that of the legislation, you as a citizen will assert your right, saying that yes, now the legislation is correct and it can govern me. As you know, Article 265 says no person shall be levied with a tax unless and until and in accordance with law. So, therefore, the concept of unjust enrichment, the doctrine of unjust enrichment you already know, and it flows from there, that if the executive have imposed a tax on you or demanded something from you and appropriated without entitlement, that is called unjust enrichment. This concept has been developed in the Excise Act, particularly in indirect tax regime, because what happens, direct tax and indirect tax are dependent, are so named because when the SSC collects tax from the consumer and pays it to that of the government, that is called the indirect tax. That means the person who pays it and on whom the incidence of liability accrues is not paying from his own pocket. He is only collecting as an agent, as an agent or trustee on behalf of the state, and that is called the indirect tax. As we know, the direct tax covers the three categories. One is income tax. Obviously, the person who is earning, he has to pay the tax, that is income tax. The second category is the gift tax and the wealth tax. These are directly levied on the person, whereas in the indirect tax like excise, customs, sales tax, service tax, entertainment tax, luxury tax, these are the taxes which are indirect. That is, a commercial entity collects it as a trustee and gives it back. Now, when a third party comes in the picture and the liability is accrued on him by virtue of a law, the unjust doctrine of unjust enrichment operates there, and you know that concepts. Here I have told you the various facets, the principles, and while I am sitting here today, I must bring you to your kind notice, I must inform you one thing, that the 9-judge Constitution bench of the Supreme Court is revisiting that 1961 and 1960 Atiyabari and automobile transportation judgment of the Supreme Court. Apparently, prima facie on the view that tax per se is outside the purview of the Part 13. So, that means any tax legislation henceforth, if tomorrow the Honorable Supreme Court will come to a finding to this extent to say that no, tax per se being a sovereign function and the facets of sovereign activity cannot fall foul with that of the Part 13 and rather is outside the purview of the Part 13, then no taxing legislation can be challenged in this in the court. Judicial review can be done on the ground of the Part 13, which says that all trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the territory of India shall be free. And this is now testing various entry tax legislation of various state governments. You need not have to be worried because this is a central legislation, that is actually state legislation. But the principle which on the basis of which the premise on the basis of which the test is being now opened up by doubting the correctness of the 1960 and 61 Atiyabari and the automobile transport case. If this prima facie view of the court will hold good tomorrow in the form of a judgment and will become the law of the land, then it has its two fallouts. One, even though the entry tax entry, that is the entry 52 of the state list is now omitted by virtue of this 122nd amendment. So, therefore, this particular judgment qua entry tax will have a no future, except will have an academic value to this extent, besides academic and also the implications on the existing tax legislation which are under challenge. And to that extent, it may declare those entry tax legislation of various state governments as legal and valid on the ground that it is not, cannot be judicially reviewed under Part 13. But yes, the judicial review under basic structure concept and the fundamental right Part 3, that is still available. So, that two grounds of challenge will not go away. The only grounds which will go away is that the Part 13. So, this is one consequence of this particular exercise which is going on about last 2 months now in the Supreme Court 9-judge Constitution bench. There is another fallout also. Today, all the state governments have agreed to a kind of a compromise formula in the form of a GST council through a constitutional amendment. Some are foregoing their rights, like fiscal legislation which was earlier there for to legislate law for imposition of the tax will no more be there, because now it will be guided by a new provision. So, therefore, the fiscal autonomy which is being now compromised through the GST council and this constitutional amendment will empower the, will give for the first time the empowerment to that of the state government to say that look here, your power to legislate tax is outside even the purview of the Part 13. I do not know what will be the consequences of that particular newfound empowerment of that of the states through this possible new legislation. But this is only a possible view, because this is, we are still in the process of argument, and it may cause some kind of possible chance operation of some state governments to say that why should be a part of a tax regime, GST tax regime, if, but we should not be circumspect about the possible effect, as long as now the amendment has been carried out. Just for the sake of information, I am just informing you this particular understanding of the law which was valid for which remained valid for about 55 years from 1960 may tomorrow change, and we will see the consequences of that on the GST tax regime. And the tax legislation under Part 13 are always tested on 3 counts. One, as I told you, the concept of functional or regulatory. If it is regulatory or functional, then it is not restrictive of trade, commerce, intercourse. Therefore, it cannot, it can pass through the muster of Part 13. A. B, if it is compensatory, then also it is not restrictive. Other than this, there is no other tests available for the tax legislations. But for the purpose of, and therefore, it is a sovereign function to legislate tax, and they can legislate, and they are doing it. The second category is, there are different kinds of other revenue model, like for example, the cess and the fees. Cess and fees, they are being regarded as a fee for services. The interpretation of the court is that any legislation on the cess or fee must be for services rendered. That means there must be quid pro quo. That means the state is collecting, or the parliament is, or the union is collecting that cess or the fees by providing some services, like for example, building and other construction workers cess, all kinds of cess, as you know, agriculture cess, education cess, these are cess, and these are not form part of the consolidated fund of India, they are being used for a particular purposes. The taxations which are collected, levied and collected by the union or the state, they use it, they form part of the consolidated fund of India or consolidated fund of the states, respective states, and they use for a particular purposes. So, tax is collected and used for a particular, for any kind of purposes, for which there is no earmarked purposes. Yes, the purposes are those which are specified in the constitution. But for cess, for surcharge, they are to be levied on provision of services. Therefore, the legislation of this cess or surcharge, they have to identify what are the areas where they are using it. Is it giving any reciprocal services? There must be a quid pro quo between that of the demand and the provision of services. That is how the concepts of the cess and surcharge is there, developed over a period of time through the judicial pronouncements, and the tax as an exaction. So, this is the difference between the tax and the cess and excise. So, all other kinds of power of the legislature to legislate the law are tested in different parameters. Now, come back to that of the, as far as the constitutional provisions and the concepts are concerned, I have given you in 2 different way, broadly made a small presentation on the provisions, broad provisions of that of the constitution, and then the concepts, judicial legal concepts on which you should test the provisions of the constitutions. Similarly, this constitutional amendment also can be tested. As a practitioner, you must have this background principles in your mind to test this. Now, let us come to that of the various aspects of the GST law now. Now, GST law which ultimately will become the law through a central GST or state GST or the IGST. IGST means the GST, goods and service tax on supply of the goods and services in the course of interstate trade and commerce under Article 269A. This legislation will come in days to come, in months to come. Broad model law is in circulation. The GST Council will sit on it again, perhaps may suggest some additional points on it. They are empowered to make suggestions and recommendations. Now, come back to the GST concepts, the various aspects of the GST. I think one of the speaker have already given the broad overview, but I will tell you why GST took so much of time. As I have already explained to you that because states were not ready to let go their financial autonomy, and that was the reason why it took so much of time for us to get GST as a reality before us, because they had set entries under state list to legislate law and get the revenue on their own, to govern their own territory. What is the idea behind the GST? A GST which was first time declared in the budget of 2006 and 7, then finance minister, with the expansive rather idea to put it in place from the 1st of April 2010. Ultimately now perhaps we are looking up to 1st of April 2017 as the day. So, there is a delay of about 7 years possibly, unless there is a further escalation. And this is on account of this tussle. It has nothing to do with that of the rights of the citizens. It was the citizens were wanting, demanding it. Now it has come, and this compromise has been arrived at. What is the broader overview of the GST? You know, GST has been designed with certain benefits, because international economic fields, they have experienced the effect of the GST and the benefit. As you know, today's world operate without boundary. There is no economic boundary today, and with the advent of technology like e-commerce, you can't have a physical barrier, so you can't even control the transaction. Therefore, integration of our domestic economy to the world in order to also become more competitive, such a regime was extremely warranted, because today it is not that you operate in a closed sphere of your physical territory. You operate throughout the world. You need to be competitive with them. You need to sell your product international market, and if your product is loaded with a tax on tax, it is costlier and it will lose its competitive edge vis-a-vis other products from other financial sector sphere. The broader benefits of the GST is this: it is consumer friendly, it avoids tax on tax, and friends, one thing you should always remember, where the state is empowered to legislate law to levy tax, but it cannot levy, demand, collect tax on tax. That is illegal. But because of the operational difficulty, it could not have been segregated, nor it could have been administered, nor it could have been managed, but it was having its negative side effects to the economy. So, all along we have even though all possible efforts were made to minimize or reduce the tax on tax effect, the cascading effect, and one of two such examples was the VAT, local sell tax, and the excise, where the SENVAT credit, debit benefits were on input, credit and debits were given the benefit, and so that the tax on tax effects is reduced. Cascading effect, reducing the cascading effect, putting it to the zero was first benefit or the objective A. Integration of the economy with that of the world economy is second, making it a more competitive third. It brings transparency fourth. It gives more opportunity fifth. It brings in space for investment. It brings in more opportunity for employment. It brings in effervescence in the economic acceleration, as it weeds out the inefficient effect of that of the tax on tax. Another benefit of the GST, perceived benefit, as of now we have not seen the benefit, but we have that experience in our excise, we had our benefit even in VAT. Will levy and collected across the board, so that the consumer know with a transparency that yes, this is the tax component of my entire consumption, which goes to that of the coffer of the state, and that's the benefit. At least you as a consumer are empowered to know what is the component of your entire consumption, or the value of your consumption comprises the tax which goes to the state exchequer. It doesn't contain the tax on tax. And of course, it makes the entire India as a one unified marketplace without any restriction or barrier, unlike in the earlier regime or the existing regime as we operate even today. It has an intangible barrier through the tax on tax legislations, various legislations. This state government is having one legislation, the other state government, adjoining states have another legislations, and and every product which it passes through the barrier, with the nature of transactions, the incidence of tax is imposed at every stages, and this effect is now being proposed to be addressed through this particular regime. There are other benefits to it. Is the valuation of the GST will be now, the GDP particularly, the economic valuation, which is the gross total of that of the consumption of the goods and services. Now the GDP valuation will reflect the true sizes of the economy. It will not be loaded with a tax on tax effect besides inefficient effects. So it makes it efficient. It also reduces the cost of the, it reduces the cost to the consumer in terms of the net effect of the tax. It also reduces the administrative cost of the business houses, consumer, citizens, administrators alike, because it will now operate through an automated system through electronic technology model, the GST network, where passbook like transaction will carry out. I think one of my speaker must have spoken to you, so I will not go into detail on that aspects, just broadly saying that this are the benefits of GST regime. And we all welcome this GST regime because of its huge potential to remove inefficiency, bring in transparency, reduce burden on the state exchequer, reduce burden on the, in terms of the administrative cost. It reduces the corruption, because all the goods and services will be part of the same network. though we have not achieved the ideal GST network where all goods and services should have been part of the network, because we are also giving some goods are and services are outside the GST regime and some are inside, but again they are exempted, and also some of the assessees will be outside because their turnover would not be higher. So, it is not an ideal GST, but we are approaching towards that direction. Maybe one day we will achieve that, when our all entire strata of our economic strata will have a parity level playing field, so that we will remove the exemption, we will bring in all the goods and services within its regime. There will be no aberrations, all the goods and services and all the transactions will be part of the same network, and it will be extremely difficult to manipulate. That is also another benefit. So, while I talk about these benefits and the overview, remember this GST is now going to, as of today, there are 4 categories of taxation regime operates as far as the union levy is concerned, this central government levy is concerned. One is the customs duty, excise duty, sales tax, central sales tax, and the fourth is the service tax. And all these 4 provisions, these levies will be subsumed to that of the GST regime. Similarly, there are state legislations and different kinds of taxations are in operation, like entry tax or octroi, which earlier it was octroi, now it is entry tax, levied by the state. Second, your entertainment tax, electricity tax, these are the current taxing regime, and of course the local VAT. So, these are the indirect tax regime of the states which are in operation. But with the new regime coming into picture, the proposed idea is to subsume these taxes into it, so that it will be unified tax, and there will be no layer of taxations at different levels at every incidence of supply, because the entire GST regime is resting on the concept of the supply. Like for example, as you know, the sales tax, the incidence of tax is on sale or purchase. In excise, the incidence of tax was in the manufacturing. In entry tax, the incidence of liability is on entry. In service tax, the incidence of liability is on service provision. But in the GST regime, the concept of tax incidence is resting on the supply. Therefore, what is the time of supply, what is the value of the supply, that is in the proposed model law of GST, which will define that in order to ensure that the liability will be fastened on every transaction. So, every product, when it passes from one person to from the producer to the consumer, with a different stages of its activity, whether through stock transfer, whether it is through sale and whether it is through improvement of that of the through input addition of inputs, every actions will or every supply will incur the GST, both by the center, because this is dual GST, both by the center and the state, both of them. The constitutional scheme as it stands today under Article 246A is that both the center as well as the states are empowered to levy tax on the supply, and every stages of supply will automatically declare your value, and on the basis of the value the incidence, and this incidence of taxes with every stages of manufacturing or processing with induction of the additional inputs or value, that will give you the input tax credit, like a credit or debit to a bank account, like in the SENVAT, like in the VAT, so that while the full value will be taxed on the supply both by the center and the states, the taxes that you have already paid, or the component of taxation that is already paid, levied and paid, collected, that will be given to you. If you are an intermediary, it will be given to you as a tax credit, input credit, so that you do not have to pay tax on tax. So, it will work on the same principle as that of the Senvat. Most of you would be knowing about how it operates, and my other speakers will tell you in detail about the manner of their operation, and I need not have to dwell on that. So, coming back to my discussion on the GST tax benefits, here is the constitutional amendment has been carried out. When we are talking about the various aspects of the GST, the constitutional amendments, and the constitutional amendment of 122, it covers 21 clauses, and the most significant and important amendment of the constitution happened with the article 246A, which gives the power to that of the union and the states to legislate law on the GST for the supply, and 269A on the IGST for the in course of the interstate trade and commerce, any sale and purchase any supply happens, where it will be levied by the union, collected by the union, appropriated by both union and the states. That is a significant. So, therefore, the states entered into this compromise formula by asking to be a pie, to receive a pie of that of the transactions, and it is actually a destination based consumption tax, where the consuming states will earn the revenue more, and there will be an incentive for them to develop that state in such a manner, they will create the more consumer who will consume that goods or services to be able to garner more revenue for themselves. So, therefore, more economic activity carried out there, the more tax revenue share will get it. Now, because in the entire proposed structure that has been enacted, some states will lose some revenue maybe for a few period, and some states will earn more because of the pattern, because earlier it was production based tax collection, now it is consumption based, end user based tax. So, therefore, there is in order to balance this difference, a compensation provision has been provided for 5 years on the basis of the suggestion on the basis of the recommendation from the GST Council on the apportionment of that compensation. That is another significant point of amendment of the constitution. Fourth important, the most significant amendment has been carried out in the GST Council. As you know, GST Council will be comprises of the state nominees, basically the state finance and revenue ministers as the members of the GST Council, and the union finance minister, cabinet minister will be the chairman of this particular GST Council, and also another the minister of state finance or revenue of the Union of India will be a member of this GST Council, and the state representative, the state finance ministers being the nominee from the different states as the member of the GST Council, they themselves will elect somebody as the vice chairman of the GST Council. So, that is how is the design, the GST Council will be constituted. Now, after this constitution happens, then the GST Council will be empowered to make recommendations on the principles of supply, the apportionment of the GST taxes between the different states, and also the principles which govern the place of supply, because place of supply is an important facet, valuation is an important facet. These are the aspects which will be ultimately decided by the recommended by the GST Council, then only on that basis the GST regime will operate, because the incidence of liability is on the supply of the goods and services, as the constitutional amendment says so. So, that is a very significant aspect. The recommending power would be, and importantly, because these are the powers has been ceded to that of the GST Council, a new constitutional regime has been created under the constitutional framework. Earlier, the power which was exercised by the parliament or the state legislature they have now been ceded to that of the GST Council, and they will recommend and they will exercise, and this is a constitutional body now, so that it will be able to run the GST regime. And the GST regime will also recommend the dates when your high speed diesel, the petroleum crudes, etc., these aviation turbine fuel, these are still part of the GST regime of goods and services, but they are now kept out of the initial commencement of its operation, and the date of their implementation will be suggested by the GST Council. And the GST Council will operate on the principle of harmonized need for harmonized GST requirement and the harmonized market for the goods and services throughout India. That will be the guiding force for the GST Council to govern its functions. And the center, with the members present there as the two representative, as the one is the member Minister of State, Finance or Revenue from the Union will be one of the member, and the chairman, the Minister of Finance or Revenue Cabinet Minister from the Union will be the chairman. They will exercise the weighted average, weighted voting right, and the Union will have a weighted voting right of 1/3, and 2/3 will rest with that of the all states put together. And here they will function like the company. As you know, a company will have the members, the body, the shareholders will have a quorum, and then in this case the quorum is a 50% of the total members, and they will sit and resolve on issues, and the disputes arising out of that shall be. Now, this is a recent amendment pursuant to that of the select committee of the Rajya Sabha recommending it, and Rajya Sabha making the changes to that. The clause, your article 279A, particularly with respect to the dispute resolution, it has been decided that mandatorily GST Council shall provide the mechanism for resolution of the disputes, because here it is a representation of all the states forming the councils to decide issues like how to run this the GST regime, and what will be the rates, what will be the special rates, what will be the band of the goods and services for what kind of rates, what will be the exemption, what will be the threshold turnover limit for exempting SSE from that of the payment from the incidence of liability of the GST. Similarly, what are the goods and services which will form, what are the taxes, and what are the goods and services will form part of the GST regime, what will be the exemptions. This recommendation will come from that of the GST Council, and what will be the rates, exemptions, special provisions. These are the recommending power of that of the, which is there in 279A clause 4. It provides the host of provisions under which activities on which it can recommend. So, that is how a lot of powers have been given to materialize this GST regime, and the dispute resolution also, a mechanism has to be provided by the GST Council for any internal dispute, so that there will be no, and this is perhaps is one of the perfect example of a regime where the inter-se relationship, the federal relationship is being lifted to another level, where the center and the states, their representative will sit together in the form of a council and then decide for the entire country. I think it's extraordinary mechanism that has been devised as a matter of compromise to this, to ensure that the GST regime will operate. Now, let us go to the other provisions of that of the amendment, the constitutional amendment. The other significant aspects is there are 3 goods or the services, they are outside the purview of the GST regime altogether. 1, real estate, any sale or purchase of real estate, that is outside the purview completely. Second, your electricity, that is outside the purview. And the third, so these are three categories of goods and services, they are outside. One is third is your alcohol for human consumption, that is also outside the purview, because service has been defined under clause 26A of article 366, where service tax, the GST tax has been defined as the tax on the supply of the goods and services other than the taxation on the alcohol for human consumption. So, that means while the goods is any commodity article which is defined under article 12 and the services is now defined under article 26A. So, they put together covers the entire gamut of the goods and services other than these 3 categories, as I told you. So, all the goods and services now is part of the taxing the GST regime except 3A. Number 3, the schedule, the schedule 7 has been amended to that entry 94, entry 84 of the union list has been amended to put the tobacco and its product in the union list, where that can not only be levied with the GST tax, but also excise duty can also be over and above that also can be levied by the union. So, that means this is a product, this is a good on which a legislation can still be made not only for the GST tax, but also for the purpose of excise duty. So, list 84 of the union list covers the tobacco product, that is amended, and 92, entry 92 is completely omitted, which talks about the taxation on the newspaper supply, sale and purchase of the newspaper and the advertisement. And 92C, which is actually the service tax, which even though was amended, constitution was amended in 2003, 88th constitution amendment, but the service tax, that is article 268A read with 92C, they never came into operation through notification, even though it became the part of the constitution. So, service tax regime, whether through the article 268A or the entry 92C, they are being now removed, completely omitted. Now, come to the state list. In the state list, the entry 52 entry tax is completely removed. Then 54 is amended, 55, 56 they are talking about, 56, 62 is actually the entertainment tax for the local bodies. So, that power is still retained through small modification in that, and whereas your the newspaper provision, that has been completely omitted. So, that it will now following part of the GST regime. So, these are the structure and the design of the constitutional amendment, and this design brought in through only 16 clauses, 16 articles, 16 in fact 14 articles have been amended or inserted or omitted, and 2 schedule 6 and schedule 7 have been modified, and that is how the entire structure is now before you through these constitutional schemes. I am saying this why it is important is that 7th schedule is giving the powers to the state and the center to legislate law, the union parliament and the state assemblies to make the law, and the necessary changes has been carried out to incorporate the GST regime, and with the GST Council at its helm, it will carry this entire structure. So, it is important is that one thing I wanted to tell you, that when the entire structure will be put in place, with of course the GST model laws are there, and the GST laws also will come into picture, and the GST Council will deliberate, though the empowered committee has already been deliberated on all these points. So, here important point is, we are in the process of making legislation. This is the time, and the Institute of Company Secretary is discharging its responsibility responsibly by putting it together the best of the mind within its resources and armory to facilitate in the legislation making process, by facilitating the empowered committee with deliberations and with the suggestions, so that a best possible taxing legislation will come. Because this is the time where all the facets must be brought to the notice of the drafting people committee, and bringing about this an important responsibility. Now, let us now go to that of the concepts of appeal and revision. So, I broadly covered the broader provisions of the constitution. Second is the various aspects of the GST regime. Now, let us talk about the appeal, the concepts of the appeal and revision. Friends, concepts of the appeal and the revision is a part of an adjudication process, and the concept of appeal and the concept of revision, there is a difference between these two. While appeal jurisdiction is exercised with a narrower space and scope, the revisional jurisdiction is a plenary. What do you mean by this? Suppose an adjudicating officer has passed an order, and a party is agreed by that. It is also there in the proposed model GST law, it is there in the chapter 18, where the appeal and the revision provision is provided. You also know that appeal provision is there in the excise, and almost all special statutes and taxing legislation provisions are there. Here, one additional requirement of revision jurisdiction has been provided. The appeal jurisdiction and the revision jurisdiction, this concept you should always remember, that appeal is exercised by appellate forum, and that appeal jurisdiction with a limited space. And what is that limited space? That it will only decide not as a original side jurisdiction, because an adjudicating officer will decide as a fact finding body, whatever the decision he will give, he will render decision as a first fact finding body. So, the appellate jurisdiction, when it is exercised, that is the appellate authority. In this case, there is one first appellate authority, and then against that order a national appellate tribunal has been designed. So, when an appellate jurisdiction is exercised, of course, we will see the text, what exactly the final text of these particular provisions will be. But then appeal jurisdiction is always exercised only on very narrower scope and space. It can exercise the jurisdiction on everything except to the extent that if a particular set of facts, more than one view is possible, then and the original side adjudicating authority decides and form a particular view, then in an appellate jurisdiction, even if the appellate jurisdiction can come to with an alternative view, plausible view, but it cannot unsettle the original view given by the original authority. That is the concept of appellate jurisdiction. For example, on a given set of facts, a original side forum yani adjudicating officer without any error in the fact, without any error on a law, forms a particular view which is plausible, and you challenge that decision in appellate jurisdiction, in appellate forum, then that appellate forum cannot unsettle that view, even if a second plausible alternative view is possible. That is the concept of the appellate jurisdiction. Whereas in a revisional jurisdiction, the revisional authority can exercise the power as a original side forum. So, its jurisdiction is wider than the appellate jurisdiction, and generally revisional jurisdiction, even in this case the proposed jurisdiction, the revisional jurisdiction will be exercised by the in-house executive, the administrators, the commissioners and all. So, the appellate jurisdiction and the revisional jurisdiction, the difference you should always remember in order to exercise your appropriate remedy before the appropriate forum. So, once an option of revisional jurisdiction lies before you and appellate jurisdiction lies, I will always suggest you go to the revisional jurisdiction, because revisional jurisdiction will exercise as a original side forum, and therefore it can also give another view different from that of the adjudicating officer. So, that is the concept of the appellate jurisdiction and revisional jurisdiction. I need not have to go to that of the model GST law on clause by clause, because it is still in the process of legislation. We are the committee of the core committee on GST by the ICSI is making serious efforts to make healthy suggestions, and these healthy suggestions will bring about a correct law for you, and rest assured there are good people are involved in this entire process. We will get a extremely good final output which will be error free, because a lot of expectations are there, and that error free legislation can only be possible when your active participation in the process, even if you are an ordinary citizen, as long as you understand the concepts, go and participate in the process and facilitate in legislation making process. I think with this I will only conclude with one point, because we can take now the questions. The recognitions as far as the Institute of the Company Secretary Professionals, Institute is really making a lot of positive efforts, and I am sure with the wisdom and with the efforts, with the sincere and honest suggestions, the process of legislation will bring about a change with significant change on the recognition of the company secretary professionals as in the auditor and all. Now, I will put it to Saurav. Now, say if we have any questions to take.
Yes, so we have a few questions, and the first question I will take it is from one of our students.
Okay.
He says that the newspapers read that the Constitution 122nd Amendment Bill has been passed.
Yeah.
But then we see that it is written that Constitution 101st Amendment Act 2016 in the notification. So, why is this difference?
Well, I will tell you. The original, the amendment, the original act, amendment 122nd Act, which was there in the as far as that particular was there, it was a bill. Now, it was converted into the approval on the 3rd of August by the Rajya Sabha and on the 8th of August by the Lok Sabha. So, after this approval, now it has come in the form of the President has given an assent. Now, the notification has to be come because it is a first amendment of the Constitution in the year 2016, and therefore, it has to be in the form of the first amendment of the year of 2016 of the Constitution. But it is the bill of 122, but the notification has to come in the form of a first.
I believe what the difference is, because many of the bills is lapse also. So, the difference is 122nd bill and act is 101st Amendment Act.
Yes, No, I tell you, bill will remain as it is, because the amendment was proposed by the select committee and it was approved by the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha, and now that it has come in the form of a notification, notification is of the year of 2016. So therefore, it has to be notified as the first bill of the year of 2016.
Yes, sir. So then a few more questions. The first question is, what is money bill and why is it not required to be passed or placed before the Rajya Sabha?
Okay, I think this issue is will be discussed by one of my colleagues. So should I?
We can take it that day then.
Yeah.
Then somebody has asked whether entry tax is constitutional.
Well, that's what I have already explained, that entry tax, actually the power lies, the entry tax is in the entry 52 of the state list of the 7th schedule, and in that various state governments have legislated entry tax from year 1900 onward, 1990s and all these legislations, some of them were challenged in the various high courts, and it ultimately went to the Supreme Court. Then Supreme Court again remanded back, referred them to the various state the high courts to decide it, the legislative the virus of those acts. Ultimately, what is happening now is that the constitution bench of 9 judges sitting, even they were there, they discussed this issue of all these matters now being clubbed together, and yesterday also they were there. The matter will will be argued on Tuesday and Wednesday, where this particular ultimate validity will be decided in that bench, the 9-judge constitution bench. Why it is 9-judge constitution bench? Because the 7-judge constitution bench of the automobile transport of 1961 and the Atyabari judgment of 1960, which I have already explained to the viewers, that the views given by the 5-judge and 7-judge constitution bench on the virus and the correctness of that view has been referred to the 9-judge constitution bench, and entry tax per se is to be tested on the ground of the part 13, and it was tested in all the judgments of the different high courts which upheld the validity, and which, so there are 2 tests. First, if the entry tax is restrictive per se to the freedom of the trade, commerce and intercourse, then in that case it may fall foul with that of the part 13. Suppose it does not, then, and whether it is falling foul with that or it is not, then in that event also then it has to be tested with that of the section 3, article 304. And till now entry tax legislation has been tested on the ground that as to whether this is restrictive to the trade, commerce and intercourse. So it has to be tested in the background of that particular legislation as to whether it is compensatory in nature or it is just a regulatory in nature. If it is regulatory or compensatory, it will pass the muster. Other than that, it will not. But that is why then it has to obtain the prior approval of that of the president. If it is not, if it is still restrictive, yes, it can still get the muster, provided it gets the president's assent under part the proviso to part 2, that is 304 part 1.
So we have a similar question. This user or viewer wants to ask, what is the constitutional validity behind levy of service tax?
Okay, service tax, in fact service tax today, as you see the regime, this is enacted through the Finance Act of 1994, and 2003 the 88th amendment of the Constitution Amendment Act of 88th amendment, the entry tax was incorporated, the entry 92C to the union list, that was incorporated with a provision of article 268A. But it was, even though it is now form part of that of the constitution, but it has not been notified for the purpose of coming into operation, because today also the regime of the service tax is operation under the Finance Act 1994. Now what is the question?
He is asking, what is the constitutional validity behind levy of service tax?
Constitutional validity of the service tax was challenged, but it was set aside because it was dismissed and the validity has been upheld by the Supreme Court. So, it is valid and legal, and therefore, unless and until there is a new law come on that, and we test it in a concepts which I have already explained to judicial review concepts, that whether it breaches the basic structure of Constitution A, whether it is a legislative competence is there or not, whether it breaches the federal, whether the power has been given, which has been given is falling foul with that of the Part 13 or not. These are to be tested, but as far as the current regime of the service tax, it is very much valid.
So, now we have a few questions from our students, although it will be a repetition of what you have already told. Still, I would like to ask you very briefly. The first student wants to know that why does introduction of GST require a constitutional amendment?
All right. As I told you, explained to you that we wanted, what is the GST? GST is a one category tax across the board throughout the territory without any physical or intangible boundary. Now, how do we achieve that? Because in our country as of today, as I told you, what are the taxing regime operating? Union taxing, there are 4 categories of union taxing regime is operating, and they are exercising this power under Union List 7 schedule. There are 6-7 categories of the different indirect tax regime operating in the states. Different state governments have different taxes. They have entertainment tax, electricity tax, they have VAT, they have series of entry tax, there are series of indirect taxes operating in different states. Now, when all these, and there are hundreds of different kinds of taxes and the legislations are operating simultaneously. Now, when all these taxes and regimes are operating and within their own limited sphere, in exercise of their own power under the 7th schedule. So, therefore, we need a one tax regime, and that could have been possible only when all these tax legislations will go or they will be subsumed to it, so that only one tax regime will come. Then how do we achieve that? In that event, suppose if it is to be administered or levied or collected or utilized by the union, then what will happen to that of the state's financial autonomy? Now, suppose if the states will be given this authority that you will levy, you will collect and you will utilize, what will happen to that of the union? So, therefore, you have to come to a middle path, and in order to achieve that middle path, you have to ensure that a constitutional amendment operates, because the power to levy tax is a provision provided in the Constitution, not in the special statutes. Therefore, an amendment to the Constitution can only bring about this change, where central government will forego some of its right to levy, state government will forego its right to levy. Thereby, a legislative, a parliamentary, constitutional amendment was carried out, and the GST Council will be the body which will carry about this regime, because at the end of the day, when the power to levy has been ceded by both the center and the states to a new body comprising of the representatives of the states, now they will decide as a representative of different states in order to protect their interests. So, the GST Council is now a statutory body exercising part rights and the powers of levy, collection, duty by the union and the states, and that is why the constitutional amendment was extremely important, and it is a new phenomenon, I mean new experiment, nowhere in operation in the world today. It is a new experiment as a middle path, and that is why we call it as a dual GST regime, where it has concurrent component of the center as well as the states.
So, I'll take one question which is connected to this only. He says, who will resolve if there is a conflict between the state, union and parliament in legislative issues?
All right. First of all, on the legislative issues, parliament and the assembly.
Yes.
Now, first of all, the constitutional amendments arrest these possibilities. The very fact that today there is a constitutional amendment was carried out, and this amendment was carried out to that of the legislative competence of the both union and the states, by bringing in suitable insertion, amendment and omission of the different articles, about 14 articles. It has brought about a situation where the legislative competence cannot be questioned, because it is, in any case, if there is a dispute between the legislative competence between the center and the states, then what it can happen is that one can go to that of the Supreme Court to resolve this dispute, because at the end of the day these are the limbs of the, these are the significant constitutional limbs of the constitution. Now, the constitutional schemes designed in such a manner, even this constitutional body, if they have their interstate disputes, can be resolved through a mechanism, through a judicial review, and that is through a suit before the Supreme Court. That is point number 1. Point number 2, the very fact of constitutional amendments carried out, it obviates all the possibilities of any friction between the legislative competence of that of this union and the states. Now, the third, as far as the GST is concerned, GST mechanism now provides a mandatory, the GST council will provide a mandatory mechanism for resolution of any interstate disputes between in the council, because GST council is nothing but an extended representative, a compendium of the extended representative of the union and the states. They will sit together and resolve all possible disputes. And of course, as you know, in any kind of a debate or discussion, there will be give and take happens. So, they will be the first body who will decide this issue. If despite that there is a dispute mechanism, dispute will come, then that mechanism will come from that of the GST council. Once the GST council will come, they will provide that mechanism. What will be, how do they tackle this problem? I hope that is the answer.
Yeah, so actually it is, this question was in 2 parts. The part 2 of the question is, sir, can you share some examples wherein Supreme Court has identified some legislature which was wherein there was a dispute between the state and the union, and the Supreme Court has ruled that it is against the constitution?
Sorry, come again, what is the question?
He says that can you share some examples wherein a legislative amendment or a legislature was found to be a bone of contention between the state and the union,
Okay.
and it was found to be against the constitution.
All right, I will tell you. Now, for example, in MMDR Act, or for that matter Gujarat Gas Act, state government of Gujarat has legislated a law to levy tax on the petroleum products which was excavated from that of the their creed, I mean within their continental shelf, and they levied it on entry tax, exercising that power. That particular legislation was struck down by the Supreme Court on challenge by saying that the entry 53 of the union list, which talks about the petroleum products in the public interest, it is expedient in the public interest where the parliament by law declare that in the public interest it is expedient to give the legislative power of the petroleum product to that of the union, then it may make the legislation. The moment that legislation is formed, then, and which is why the MMDR Act is there, then the state is denuded of the power to legislate on that issue. And state, despite that, made a legislation qua the petroleum product, which was challenged, and that provisions were struck down, saying that you lack the legislative competence even if it is a product from out of your land, and land is a state subject, because the state was arguing that land is a state subject, a produce of the land should also be regarded as within its purview to legislate, and that is why they made that legislation. That legislation was struck down, saying that no, where there is a conflict between the two entry, like entry 53 under which the MMDR Act is in operation, and entry your 23 the land 18 or 23 of the state list, then 53 will prevail over that. So, that is how the legislative competence is decided. So, that is how this is one of the legislation. There are umpteen number of legislations have been declared as ultra vires the constitutional design.
So, after the amendment, list 92 will be deleted. So, what will be the constitutional validity of service tax from now till the time GST comes into force?
Today, the amendment of the constitution, the 122nd amendment constitution, which talks about the entry 92, that is omitted. Entry 92 is no more in the as far as the constitution is concerned. The amendment has been now signed by this thing. The moment that particular amendment has been notified, the moment it is notified, then you are talking about entry 92.
Yes, yes, service tax.
The moment that 92 is not service tax, 92C is a service tax.
He says that the amendment has deleted list 92. So, now what will be the constitutional validity of service tax?
Okay.
Till
92C, actually 92C is actually the service tax. Now, okay, I wanted to modify his question from 92 to 92C. Now that this is no more there in the constitution, the statute book, one should remember, first of all, 92C, as I told you, was incorporated in the year 2003 Wide Constitution 88 Amendment. Despite this was never notified till date. And similarly, the provision for service tax, which is also there for apportionment in article 268A, that was also, despite it was there in the constitution, because it was got the assent of the president, it was also that amendment was notified, but it was never been notified for the purpose of operation. Therefore, these are the two articles under which the laws were never made. So, therefore, even the today's existing regime, right, the today's existing regime, that will not make that existing regime as invalid. So, mere notification of this amendment to constitution will not unsettle the existing service tax regime. But be that as it may be, regarding the notification, it will come in piecemeal. For example, the president has given the consent to that constitution, but to give it into effect, it will give into effect when the regime is ready. So, the clause by clause notification and the different provisions which will, now that act is in operation, the act of 2016 is now in operation, but the clauses 1 to 21, they will come in phases as and when our regime is ready, and it will come only in the 31st night March 2017. Yeah. Once that regime is ready, otherwise it will not be, it will create a vacuum.
Maybe the last question for this today. It says, is the judicial review of Supreme Court an automatic procedure, or President of India or the judges or some other institution ask or request the Supreme Court to compare the legislation in view of the Constitution?
Well, judicial review now being exercised by two means, and of course there are three means rather. One is on a presidential reference by the Supreme Court. Judicial review is exercised under Article 32 by the Supreme Court, where fundamental rights are to be the citizens are asking to enforce the fundamental rights, Article 32. So, judicial review is exercised under Article 32 by the Supreme Court. The judicial review power also is lying with that of the High Court, constitutional courts under Article 226. And that is not only the fundamental rights, enforcement of fundamental rights, but also the legal rights. So, judicial review is exercised under these two articles. Besides that, where there is a doubt about any particular constitutional provisions, then the President can also refer to the apex court for giving its final view on that. Like as we know, there are number of references have happened where the President takes the advice of that of the Supreme Court under a reference in that happened in 1998, where the third judge's case in the collegium system, that advocate Scora, that is Supreme Court advocate on record case, and a reference was made as to whether the Article 124, the consultation is concurrence or not on that limited question. Then they reiterated the second judge's case, 1993 judge's case, Scora case, and they rather expanded that concept of collegium system. This is one. So, precedent on a reference on a doubt of any question of constitutionality can refer to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court can give that view for the because Supreme Court is the final arbiter when it comes to the taking a view on the legality. Declaration of law, because they exercise power under Article 141 as far as the declaration is concerned. Judicial review also exercised through PILs now, and any public spirited person can trigger the judicial review of Article 32 and 226 of the Constitution for a decision by the. So, that means individuals can go, your corporates can go, but then of course with the citizens, because when it comes to the fundamental right, mostly it is individual only. So, fundamental right enforcement has to happen. As long as legal rights are concerned, it can be carried out by the corporates, but fundamental rights to be enforced by individuals. So, individuals, corporates and all entities can go. Besides that, a public spirited entity in the form of a PIL can also trigger the judicial review. So, that is how the judicial review is exercised, and Supreme Court from time to time exercises that power, where they ensure that the clarity on the subject of law, particularly the constitutionality, because at the end of the day constitutional courts are empowered to give the constitutional principles, and they are only entitled to evaluate the validity of the legislations made by the parliament, because it is actually flowing from the constitution. So, therefore, no ordinary courts, no ordinary tribunal, no authorities can test the validity of a legislations. So, judicial review can happen with respect to executive action, judicial review can happen with respect to the legislation, and judicial review is extremely wide. At the end of the day, the interpretation lies with the final arbiter, that is the court, and the constitutional courts particularly, and they exercises their power so that the principles of constitutions, such as I told, what is our fundamental principles, what is the basic structures of constitution, what is that the democracy, principle of democracy, what is sovereignty, what is separation of power, what is legislative relations between the states and the union. So, these are all constitutional concepts, they exercises it, and that is how they exercise that power for the larger good of the common man and country, to govern them. That is how the judicial review is exercised. And as far as I think you have no other queries,
No,
and
that was the last question.
your viewers should know that the core team is really doing great job for the particularly the GST core team, and facilitating to that of the empowered committee, and I am sure in days to come with this empowering classes going on, your members as well as your students can come forward with their ideas, because principles of law is resting on the principles of ideas, and it is an evolving process. The courts also evolves it over a period of time, and that is how it is making us and develop, because with the passage of time, with the need of the society, with the changes of different structures, the principles keep evolving, and that is why the empowerment, your institute is doing good job by putting in these exercises with the GST Council and of course the Empowerment Committee, and I am sure you will ultimately get your recognition for your professionals for the audit and all. So, that is how. Is anything else you have to say?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sparing your valuable time and explaining everything in such a short duration.
Thank you.
And we sincerely believe that our participants have enriched throughout the session. Friends, the next webinar will be having deliberations on supply of goods and services under the GST law. It will be at the same time 2 p.m. next Friday, that is September 16, and at the same link. So, do tune in. Thank you.
Thank you.